My name's Robert, and I used to be a normal guy with a normal job. And then I saw Bigfoot, and basically my whole life became anything but normal. I researched every day as much as I could get my hands on, read every scrap of material I could find on the subject. I went on Sasquatch expeditions and even delved into things that most Sasquatch enthusiasts aren't willing to. And after all that time and effort thinking about this nearly nonstop for almost a year and a half, the main thing I learned is that I've been wrong a lot more than I've been right. And you'll see what I mean, because in this video, I'm going to share with you everything I've learned about Bigfoot. And I suggest you brace yourself, because the further down this rabbit hole you go with me, the weirder it gets. So like I said, this all came about for me beginning in September 2024, almost a year and a half ago at the time of the filming of this video, when I saw what I eventually concluded could only be a Sasquatch. But it wasn't just a plain sighting. It didn't start that way anyway. It was a bizarre series of events that I think were all brought about by Sasquatch upon further reflection after the fact. I was vacationing with my wife and daughter on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, Canada. We had always wanted to see the West Coast, hadn't made it out there yet. So we booked this small cottage on the southern tip of the island, a little village called Shirley. There were a lot of trees, a lot of big patches of forest around, and a lot of beaches as well. Not the manicured white sand kind, but the unkempt wild kind, with trees and driftwood coming right up to the water, and lots of rocks and caves and rock formations. And my wife and daughter and I were on this one particular beach one day towards the end of our trip. No one else was there, and there was this tall, wet, stony cliff. It was wet from the spray of the ocean, and there was trees and foliage on top of it, kind of sloping up at a sharp angle. My daughter and I, she was 7 at the time, we were climbing up this large driftwood log when all of a sudden this stone flew out of that clifftop forest and hit the log about a foot from my daughter's head. Like I said, it was sloped up there. There was a lot of tangled foliage. There was just no access for a person unless they were, an elite mountain climber or something. And I started to think about how stones being thrown was an aspect of the Sasquatch phenomenon that I'd heard about before. And that kind of got the wheels of curiosity turning in my head. So later that day, it was actually night by this point, I took a walk in the woods. I have always been a naturally curious person, always attracted to the unknown. That's probably what set me up to turn into a quote-unquote Bigfoot researcher. But anyway, I took this walk in the woods. The forest on Vancouver Island is full of black bears and mountain lions and who knows what else, and I did not have a weapon. I ended up hearing 2 sounds that quickly convinced me to leave the forest. The first one was a kind of grunt or growl sound, but deeper and more resonant than any grunt I'd ever heard from a person, although it was weirdly kind of person-like. But it also didn't sound like a bear or a mountain lion. I'm fairly familiar with the sounds of those animals, and I know they can make all sorts of different sounds, but I've heard most of those sounds at one time or another, and this wasn't that. And then, 30 seconds later, maybe less, I heard the sound of a tree twisting, like wood fibers creaking and breaking. There wasn't any wind, there wasn't a breeze that could have caused a branch to make that noise. So these 2 noises in quick succession scared the living daylights out of me, so I just hightailed it out of there. Got back to the cabin, told my wife what happened, called my dad back in Ontario, told him what happened. Then I decided to go back the next day. In the light of day, the next day, my curiosity had rekindled. The fear had ebbed somewhat, so I went back, and I found the spot where I thought the 2 sounds had come from the day before. I couldn't be sure because it was quite dark, as I said, and I only had my phone flashlight the prior night when I'd heard the sounds. But before I could go up and examine the trees, I saw a huge black shape, 70 yards or so, into the bush ahead of me, and it had moved. I looked at it, and it didn't look like it was alive in that it didn't have any recognizable shape. It didn't look like a bear. It didn't have an obvious head, shoulders, arms, and legs the way a person, or a Bigfoot for that matter, would have, or at least I expected they would have. It was just big and hulking and black and formless, really. But the thing is, it had moved. I was certain I'd seen it move. got the footage, but it seemed to be staying stock still while I filmed it. But I saw this thing, and I had this feeling of dread somehow. Like, I knew it was alive, it had moved, and somehow it didn't feel right to stay there. So I got out of there. I got out of there fast. Anyway, all that started me down this rabbit hole. I had this YouTube channel prior to this experience, but it wasn't about Bigfoot at all. Maybe you're even someone who's been watching me long enough to know that I started this to kind of document our rural life here in the woods of northern Ontario, Canada. That was what the channel was originally for, but since seeing what I saw and concluding that I know it wasn't a black bear, it was too big, it was too tall, it was the wrong shape, and I know it wasn't anything else known and officially classified in those woods, so I had to conclude, honestly kind of reluctantly, that what I had seen was a Sasquatch, or what people call Bigfoot, or hairy man, whatever you want to call it. But I decided to start making videos about the Sasquatch phenomenon because I knew I'd be researching it. I knew I had to have answers about what I had seen, trying to fully understand the truth of the situation, basically. So I started looking into all the usual Bigfoot things, the Patterson-Gimlin film, the footprints, the hair, the eyewitness accounts. But I also tried to balance that with a good hard look at the skeptical side of the balance sheet. What are skeptics really saying about Bigfoot? What are the common objections to the purported evidence? I wanted to know all of that. And pretty quickly I discovered that the evidence was, in my opinion, a whole lot more compelling than I thought. I knew what I'd seen, but I also knew the 20 seconds or so of footage I'd gotten wasn't going to convince anyone on its own. So I started looking at the Patterson-Gimlin film. I dug into it in detail. I read books about it. I watched it frame by frame, forwards, backwards, zoomed in, zoomed out, the original and the restored versions. And I read what people smarter than me had to say about it. Scientists, anthropologists, primatologists, locomotion experts. But I also read what people who were well-educated but skeptical of the film's authenticity had to say. After a lot of sifting through that research on the Patterson-Gimlin film, I came to the conclusion that it's the genuine article. That back in 1967, Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin really did see a female Sasquatch there in Bluff Creek in Northern California, walking across this dry riverbed, leaving very convincing footprints with a whole lot of morphological detail that would be difficult to impossible for a person to fake. According to the late Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who I spoke with at length about this and other Bigfoot-related topics, it wouldn't just be difficult to fake those footprints, it would be completely and utterly impossible. And not for lack of trying on the part of hoaxers either, I can tell you. The creature in the film got the nickname Patty, and Patty had a number of details about her, as seen in various versions of the film, that were very difficult to dismiss as a man in a suit, which is basically the only reasonable argument against authenticity. It's not like they had CGI or AI-generated videos back then. Okay, guys, I want to pause here for a moment to make sure that point is really clear. The Patterson-Gimlin film was shot in the 1960s. No AI, no CGI, meaning, again, if the footage is a hoax, it has to be a man in a suit. A man in an incredibly intricate suit, who can also take 4-foot strides. But we're going to talk more about why the man in a suit hypothesis falls apart in a moment. First, I want to talk about the nature of hoaxes, the tools of deception. You see, they've drastically evolved since then. In 1967, if you wanted to fool someone, you had to physically fabricate something. But today, the tools of deception are entirely digital, and the target isn't some blurry camera lens. It's you. We spend so much time analyzing old footage for authenticity, but we still haven't become proficient at scrutinizing the authenticity of the digital world all around us. And that's exactly what identity thieves and scammers rely on. They don't need a monkey suit to trick you. They just need your data, your very personal and private information. I'm not joking, guys. Google your name and address right now. I promise you'll be shocked at how much of your personal information is out there, publicly viewable. It's honestly scary. That's why I've partnered with Incogni. You might have heard of services that remove your data from standard data broker lists, but the internet is bigger than just data brokers, and that's why I want to talk specifically about Incogni's custom removals feature. This is what really sets them apart. Incogni's custom removals tool is designed for general removal from the internet. If you find your personal information exposed on a site that isn't covered by a standard broker database, you don't just have to accept it. Incogni will remove it for you. With custom removals, you can take that specific URL, flag it within Incogni, and they'll go to work. They contact that specific site on your behalf and demand that your information be removed. Incogni is giving you the power of choice when it comes to your personal information. And in this day and age, when anyone can grab a photo and use AI to turn it into a video, the choice Incogni offers has never been more important. And right now, guys, Incogni is offering a special limited time deal for anyone watching this video. You can get 60% off an annual plan when you scan the on-screen QR code or click the link in the description or pinned comment and use the code CABIN at checkout. Incogni is no joke, guys. When I was first approached by them to do these sponsored segments, I was honestly skeptical that they could do what they advertised, until I used it myself. And the results? Well, they speak for themselves. Since installing Incogni, they've completed 32 automatic removal requests of my personal information and have scheduled another 23 for removal. That's over 50 instances total where my personal private data has been scraped, bought, sold, and posted online without my knowledge. Protect your identity so you can focus on the mysteries that actually matter. Now, if the creature filmed in Bluff Creek in '67 wasn't a digital fake, was it a physical one? Well, let's get back into it. So the things that stood out the most for me about Patty are, first of all, that you can see visible muscle movement, the contraction of her thigh muscles and her glutes, her rippling back muscles. You can also see certain details in her gait and her feet, the way she propels herself forward. It's not like the way a human walks. There was a guy called Bob Hieronymus who tried to claim that it was actually him in the suit, but when you compare his walk and Patty's walk, particularly the fact that the footprints cast by Patterson-Gimlin and other people later at the film site in '67, they were like 4 feet apart. And almost no one on the planet's going to take steps 4 feet apart, including this guy, Bob Hieronymus, who claimed that Roger Patterson hired him to wear a Bigfoot suit. But what I didn't realize at first was that there is some amazing restoration work of the frames of the Patterson-Gimlin film, all 1,000 or so frames, being done by a guy named Todd Gatewood. He's a professional photo archivist, and you may have seen some of my videos about his work in the past. But basically, this guy is painstakingly restoring and cleaning up every single frame of the Patterson-Gimlin film. Not adding any detail that wasn't there, but clarifying and removing scratches and dust and distortion and basically cleaning out the lens blur with non-AI techniques to reveal some absolutely stunning visuals of this creature, this Sasquatch that Patterson and Gimlin filmed in October of '67. I've known Todd Gatewood for a long time, and I questioned him hard on how we could know that these incredible details really were taken from this old piece of footage. It seems impossible, especially in this day and age of digital videography, where if you zoomed in this far, you'd see nothing but pixels, even if it was, 4K video. Trust me when I say it is legitimate. I examined every possible way that this could not be true, and I discovered that really there's no option other than it is true. So, of course, after my detailed examination of the Patterson-Gimlin film, I looked at many other purported Sasquatch video clips. And some of them I found authentic, and some of them I didn't. But it wasn't long before I started to get dissatisfied with shaky, blurry videos. I just figured there had to be more substantial evidence, something physical that we could put our hands on. So I started looking at things like footprints and hair samples, and after talking with people like the late Dr. Jeff Meldrum, who I've interviewed and had on this channel before, I learned that there's actually a whole lot of detail about many Sasquatch footprints that have been cast and preserved in plaster. Things like mid-tarsal breaks, pressure ridges, toe splay, slippage, differences from one print to the next as the terrain differs, injuries that are seen in a certain print that actually change locations over time in prints from the same individual found years later as the scar tissue shifts, as layers of skin grow. All sorts of really neat details, forensic level details in my opinion, that we can discern from these footprints that indicate that they were made by a real creature, not a guy strapping on Bigfoot feet, but a real, heavy, muscular creature propelling itself forward on human-like feet that are 18, 19, 20 inches long or more, and that hinge in the middle. That's the mid-tarsal break, as it's known. Something that Dr. Jeff Meldrum talked about at length, as you probably know. And then there are hair samples, and I looked into that as well. There have been hairs discovered that, under a microscope, look a whole lot like human hair and known primate hair, the hair of creatures like gorillas and chimpanzees and so forth, but don't quite match either of those. Again, they have many of the morphological characteristics of primate hair, and yet are officially classified as unknown when held up against all the known hair samples that we have of every known classified animal in North America. So putting all this together, footprints and hair and other little tidbits of physical evidence, it became quite clear that there is a very strong case to be made that these beings are absolutely real. And for a long time, I preached that same sermon in different ways on the channel as I uncovered these things in my research. My hypothesis was simply that given the over 2 billion acres of forest in North America alone, these beings exist, but basically are just really good at hiding. So again, at this point, I knew they were real because the scanty amounts of physical evidence we do have are actually pretty conclusive when you get right down to the nitty-gritty and understand that physical evidence in all its detail. But the obvious question that skeptics rightly continued to ask is, where's the body? So that's what I looked into next. And I discovered that although there are no officially documented Sasquatch bodies on record, there are numerous people who report seeing authorities taking bodies away. Of course, it's only anecdotal because the body's gone, but a lot of people report that. And I found I was having a harder and harder time assuming that they were all liars. Most of them didn't even seem to want the attention. They were just reluctantly sharing their story on some obscure platform, and the stories were consistent. You know, the usual stereotypical thing. There seemed to be something to it. Men in black suits showing up and carting off this body after someone shoots one or hits one with their car or who knows what. I was seeing it again and again. But I eventually came across another reference to a purported Sasquatch body that was actually much more substantial because of how well documented it was. And that's the Minnesota Iceman. Now, if you look up the Minnesota Iceman on Wikipedia, you will see in the first line of the article that it's considered a hoax, a fake Sasquatch body made of latex or some other material that was displayed at carnivals during the 1960s. The trouble with that explanation is that 2 different scientists, zoologists, spent 3 full days examining this body and wrote about their examination in great detail, and they said it was real. They said that there was no way the detail in this body could have been faked. The hairs and the skin texture and the wounds and damage and the broken arm that it had on one side and the bullet hole in its head which caused one of its eyes to pop out. All of these things indicated realness to these 2 highly qualified, well-trained zoologists. And that was a pretty unsettling conclusion.
There was no doubt that we were looking at some sort of man. Not Homo sapiens, but some sort of strangely hairy man.
There was what seems to have been a real Sasquatch body toured around the country and showed at carnivals during the 1960s. So after I researched this enough to believe it was true based on all the evidence, I made a video about it. And that's when something really shocking started to happen. In the comments of that video, people started to chime in who are old enough to remember the Minnesota Iceman. And they started to share with me seeing it when it was toured through their hometown at a local carnival or something. And they would talk about the details. They would talk about how it stank, it smelled of decay, how they could see real blood frozen in the ice block that surrounded it, how they could see one of its feet sticking out of the block of ice where the ice had melted a little bit and the toes were starting to rot, and it was really obviously a real carcass of this large, tall, hair-covered, man-like but not human creature of some sort. After the footprints and hair, I started to look at Sasquatch DNA. And of course, you can't look into Sasquatch DNA without bringing up the Melba Ketchum Sasquatch Genome Project, which was a well-funded study done, about 10 years ago now. I'm trying to think. I'm blanking on the exact date. But basically, this lady, a geneticist and veterinarian from Texas, I believe, did this years-long study with several other PhDs involved and a whole team of non-scientific people helping the scientists. And they brought together and collected from the entire continent over 100 samples of purported Sasquatch DNA. Hair with tissue still on it, blood, skin, even purported scat, I believe, and exhaustively tested these materials under the harshest scientific scrutiny, and basically determined that not only were they real and came from an unknown species, but that that species was half human. That's what the DNA read as. The profiling came back as human from the maternal side, but of unknown origin from the paternal side. That just made things more confusing on one level, because, of course, certain factions of the Bigfoot enthusiast crowd, including some scientists, felt that if this creature exists, it's just an undiscovered ape. It's basically just a North American gorilla that walks on two legs. But the Ketchum study, the Sasquatch Genome Project, cast serious doubt on that conclusion because, again, we were dealing with something that seemed to be some sort of half-human hybrid. So what do you do with that? I personally had no idea, but I did make a video examining the Ketchum study in which I came to the conclusion, after exhaustive research, that the study was legitimate. And I felt I had to set the record straight because so many people, the larger scientific community and completely unqualified peanut gallery type people, basically trashed the study and dragged Dr. Ketchum's name through the mud. Their main complaints were that the samples that were gathered and tested were contaminated by humans, and that's why they read as partially human, and that Dr. Ketchum published the study in her own scientific journal, not in someone else's journal, so all objectivity was gone in the minds of the critics. Trouble is, that wasn't quite the whole story. And I won't go into the whole story here. I've done that elsewhere, and I'll probably do it again in the future. But the short version is that the samples were not contaminated. They were rigorously treated and tested. And as far as publication, Dr. Ketchum and her team actually had a pre-existing arrangement with a well-known scientific journal who promised to publish the findings of her study when it was done. But when it was done, and the findings were shown to be so controversial, that not only do Sasquatches exist and have DNA, but that DNA points to a partially human origin, well, that scientific journal stopped returning Dr. Ketchum's calls. And so did every other scientific journal that she tried to reach out to, her and her entire team of multiple PhDs. So the bottom line is that she had to start her own scientific journal to publish the study at all. It's called De Novo Scientific Journal. And again, people really trashed her and her work because of that. But when you look at all the details, and you read the book Truth Denied, the Sasquatch DNA study by Scott Carpenter, you start to see that the trashing and the dismissal was completely unjustified. So I was extremely intrigued by this conclusion that I eventually decided was a legitimate conclusion based on the science of the study, that, again, Sasquatches are partially human in origin, that the maternal side of their DNA can be traced to a human lineage about 15,000 years ago from the Middle East, of all places. It seemed like a tantalizing clue as to the origin of these beings, and yet it just kind of confused the issue further on a number of levels. But on other levels, it actually jived fairly well. For instance, a lot of purported Sasquatch encounters involve eyewitnesses saying that what they saw looked remarkably human. Big and wide and muscular and hairy, certainly, but in terms of its face, the facial details, the nose, the cheekbone structure, and the expression, the emotion in the eyes. A lot of times people said, I thought I was looking at a weird, big, hairy man. So that kind of fit with this whole human hybrid conclusion from the Sasquatch Genome Project study, as weird and unsettling as that seems. At this point, I really didn't know what to make of the whole Sasquatch thing. I had gone from being firmly convinced that they were simply an undiscovered ape, as many Sasquatch enthusiasts and researchers still believe now, to believing they were partially human. I had also examined what I felt were all of the most compelling purported Sasquatch video clips and filtered out the ones that I thought were fake and collected the ones that I thought were real. But there was one set of footage that I had to take a second look at. Not because it wasn't very intriguing, but because it was so controversial. And that's the footage collection of Todd Standing. He's claimed again and again that it's real, that his work is legitimate, and also the faces he's captured in his footage are so strange and alien to people that I think their knee-jerk reaction very often is that these things are fake. So I set out to find out for sure. I looked very closely at Todd's footage. I examined his claims. I talked with him for like 3 hours, cross-examining him hard about every detail, not just in the footage itself, but what he was doing when he got that footage, and why the footage seems to have been cut, why it isn't full length, and what clues or supporting evidence he could give for the authenticity of the footage. I also listed every single accusation I could find online from those who tried to debunk Todd and his work, and there were some pretty substantial arguments there. But after digging into this as hard as I could, the conclusion I came to is that Todd's videos are 100% authentic. Every argument against authenticity of his work doesn't hold water logically, and I've looked at every one of them. I've pressed them extremely hard, just as I pressed Todd and his footage extremely hard with a skeptical lens. And the footage holds up. There's no two ways about it. You may not like that conclusion, or find that because his footage just looks fake to you, you assume it is fake, but that's not scientific, and that's not logical. And my whole shtick on this channel since day one has been to try to be as scientific and logical as I possibly can. I think it's extra important when you're examining something so weird and fringe and taboo as Bigfoot. So I did that video and I published it, but I wasn't expecting what it would ultimately lead to. Where it eventually led was me going on a Sasquatch expedition with Todd Standing and a small team of researchers to the remote forests and mountains of a certain part of British Columbia. And some things happened on that expedition. Nothing that I can conclusively call proof, but I was sleeping in a trailer, and the trailer was shaken multiple times. I know it wasn't a person. I don't think it was another animal. We also put apples high up in trees, and we took certain precautions to make sure that bears or other animals wouldn't disturb them, or at least if they did, that we'd know about it. And those apples were all taken. They all disappeared without a trace. And we found broken trees that appeared to have been snapped off and left hanging by a few threads. Not the sort of break that natural forces can produce. Always trees broken at a certain angle, always pointing in a certain direction. Sometimes trees woven together in impossible ways that, again, nature wouldn't have been able to do, and a person wouldn't have the strength to do in many cases. Some of these trees that were snapped off like matchwood were like 3 or 4 inches in diameter. And again, not broken in the way that snow load or heavy wind or rot would produce. I've seen broken trees all my life. I literally live in the woods here in northern Ontario, and there's a difference between a tree that has been broken by nature versus snapped in a huge pair of hands. And although I was very skeptical of quote-unquote Sasquatch tree breaks prior to the trip with Todd in October, I revised my opinion, especially after one of our expedition members, a structural engineer named Richard, explained the difference to me between shear breaks, which are the natural breaks that happen out in the wild by snow or wind, versus tensile breaks, which are the sort that require a restraining mechanism of some sort when the snap of wood happens. So we saw a lot of those and a lot of these, again, twisted tree structures, but the culmination of everything for me on that trip was when I caught a very brief glimpse of a Sasquatch. I was the only one on the expedition who saw it, and I wish so much that I hadn't been, because of course no one's going to believe me if they have a skeptical bone in their body, and I can't blame them. I had taken a little walk away from the rest of the group through some thick deadfall in the middle of the woods on one particular day, and I saw this upright light brown shape towering above the branches and trunks on the forest floor, streak across my field of vision, not loping through the deadfall trunks like you'd think it would be, but almost moving like it was hovering, like it was locked onto a rail, just a perfectly smooth, just super fast. It was over in less than a second, or maybe 2 seconds at the most. And I didn't manage to get it on camera. It was so fast. But I heard some noises as well, some tree breaks shortly before it ran across my field of view, and one of the other expedition members heard those sounds as well. So at least I had a little bit of corroboration. All of these things cemented for me that as divisive as this opinion is, as divisive as this conclusion is, Todd Standing was and is a real, legitimate, truthful Sasquatch researcher. His footage is real, and I experienced Sasquatch well out on expedition with him. But it turns out, at the time of that expedition, I wasn't done tossing out my old conclusions about Bigfoot and adopting new ones. Because around that time, I decided that I could no longer ignore the quote-unquote woo-woo elements of the Bigfoot phenomenon, the paranormal stuff, the line of thinking that draws lines between Bigfoot and orbs or UFOs, the kind of thinking that allows for potential cloaking, the ability to turn invisible, in other words, even telepathic abilities, things like mind speak. When I first started looking into this, I assumed all that was nonsense, but I was wrong. As I examined the testimonies of people whose encounters with Bigfoot included some sort of paranormal element, and also looked at some of the footage of orbs and floating lights, which were often reported to appear before, during, or after a Bigfoot encounter, the consistency is actually what sealed it for me, because if you're making something up, or if you're trying to will something into being real, your particular made-up thing is going to be different than everyone else's. But the woo-woo crowd, when it comes to Bigfoot, they were all saying the same things, more or less. That these beings can appear or disappear at will, that these beings can speak to you in your head without ever making a sound, that these beings are more than just undiscovered apes. I just felt in my gut that there was more to the phenomenon, and that kind of reached a head when I was doing some research for one of my videos, examining a certain piece of footage that was actually filmed, believe it or not, about 30 miles from where I had my initial sighting. Not the Todd Standing sighting, but the original one on Vancouver Island that set me down this rabbit hole. I was looking back at my video from the night before I saw the creature, the night when I went walking in the woods and I heard the weird grunt sound. I actually got that sound on camera. I didn't get the tree twist on camera. I had already stopped the recording by then, unfortunately, but I noticed something in my footage from that night that I hadn't seen in person. I think because I was looking down at my shoes and worrying about tripping over a root or something like that at the instant this happened. But at the very moment that that grunt or growl occurred, there was this momentary brief flash of kind of reddish light. This was the middle of the woods. There was no one around, no houses, no trail cams. I looked into that. There was no reasonable explanation for that sudden momentary flash of light at the very moment I heard the sound that I heard. But there it was. You can see it for yourself. Let's see what I can find in here. That's when I started to realize that it was time to open my mind further, to look into the possibility that there may be more to these beings than a simple unclassified animal. I started to realize that the paranormal elements to these creatures that a lot of people talk about may not be complete hogwash after all, as I had assumed for so long. Something else came to light around this same period of time and research, something that further shook me up in my conclusions that I really couldn't dismiss when I examined it thoroughly. And that was the conclusion that Sasquatches have a language. By the human definition of a language, a series of sounds with specific meanings that they can convey complex ideas with. I came to this conclusion after examining some audio recordings captured in the 1970s, known as the Sierra sounds. There were these two guys, Ron Moorhead and Al Berry, who had been getting reports about potential Sasquatch activity in the Sierra Nevada mountains. So they hiked out there with a bunch of locals, and they eventually discovered signs of Sasquatch activity. And then they started hearing these sounds at night around their camp, getting closer and closer in. And they tried to get it on video, but reportedly every time they got a video camera going, all activity would stop. They tried to hide cameras under barrels. They tried to set trigger-activated cameras with little traps on strings and things, and none of it worked. They weren't able to outsmart these beings. But everyone present was absolutely certain that the beings were there. What were they going to do? How would they get evidence? Well, the best they could do, as it turns out, was to get a series of audio recordings. The tape recorders they used didn't seem to bother the creatures. These sounds, known as the Sierra sounds, were captured, and they're weird. They made my skin crawl the first time I heard them, and a lot of people have that same reaction. Of course, a lot of people also have the reaction of laughing and saying, well, I could make sounds just like that, or my dog does those kind of sounds all the time. But none of those people have ever managed to produce any substantial evidence of hoaxery. But there is a lot of substantial evidence that the recordings are authentic, and much of it centers around a guy named Scott Nelson. He's a retired crypto-linguist who used to work for the U.S. Navy, decoding languages in certain transmissions, basically. The guy is a language expert. He heard these recordings and studied them and realized pretty quickly that they have all the hallmarks of an intelligent language by the human definition of a language. I looked into all his work in detail. I listened to the man speak and explain his conclusions and play back certain sections of the recordings and slow them down and speed them up. And I found his points to be solid. After exhaustive research, I came to the conclusion that Scott Nelson is completely right, that the Sierra sounds not only were not emitted by human vocal cords, nor did they come from any other known animal, but that they did indeed contain linguistic elements. And the more you listen to them, the more I think you'll start to realize that this is a pretty inescapable conclusion, to be honest. It also ties back nicely to the controversial findings of the Ketchum study. Half human, half something else, it kind of makes sense that there would be a level of intelligence there that could formulate language, proper communication as humans understand communication. So where did all this leave me exactly? Just to recap everything I'd learned, I had personally experienced, I had seen them multiple times. I had learned that they have human genetics, at least partially. I had learned that they have the intelligence to form a language, that they're extremely elusive, and that when they do show up on video, it's almost never clear, but there are a few exceptions to that. And then I had come to the reluctant conclusion that somehow these beings have paranormal capabilities. I didn't mention before that I had also spoken with people who I very much trust, people who I know have a solid head on their shoulders and aren't given to flightiness or fantasy of any sort, who have experienced mind speak, telepathy that they feel came from a Sasquatch. Multiple times this has happened to people I very much trust. So I just realized I couldn't write all that off anymore. I couldn't throw it out. But what did that tell me? What conclusion could I draw from that in my quest to uncover the full truth about these beings? I had no idea. And honestly, I still don't. The more deeply I look into this, the less I realize I know. That's when I decided to stop looking forward for a while and start looking backward. But I didn't realize how unprepared I was for what I'd find looking for Sasquatch in the past. Through a lot of research, my friend Josh and I discovered that Sasquatches were not only commonly mentioned in antiquity, but they were often depicted in ancient art. They were written about in ancient journals. They were carved into the wooden seats of ancient cathedrals. And some well-known Christian saints, like St. Augustine, even openly speculated on whether or not these beings, obviously intelligent as they were, could be baptized. That's not the sort of question you ask about a mythological creature. It's something you ask about a creature you know to be real. But it wasn't just religious antiquity where these beings were mentioned in the past. Indigenous traditions are also rich with stories about Sasquatch or the hairy man, or depending on which tribe you talk to, the Saskets or Bukwas. There are many different terms, but bottom line is there's a great deal of consistency across different tribes in different parts of the continent, dating back as long as we can really remember, and probably longer. And none of the indigenous folks I've spoken to about Sasquatch feel that these beings are simply another animal. What they feel is that they're another tribe of people who potentially come from the stars, according to some tribes, and who have special abilities, and also who you don't want to mess with. Most recently, I collaborated with 3 researchers who have been documenting evidence on a certain rural property in Pennsylvania where there not only seems to be ample Sasquatch activity, but these beings somehow are able to leave evidence behind and make noises, but not appear on any of the cameras blanketing this land, which, given how many cameras these researchers have set up, should be physically impossible. And yet it's happening. At this point, I've certainly seen enough evidence to fully believe that these beings are capable of cloaking or turning invisible, however you want to categorize it. They're real, they're physical, they're biological, but they're also more than that. They have partially human genetics. They're capable of forming language. They seem to be able to cloak and make noises without appearing on the cameras. They're recording those noises, even when by all rights they should. They seem to be able to communicate telepathically with people, as difficult a pill as that is to swallow. It's happening. It's reported consistently. They also have some sort of connection with orbs, also known as floating lights. Some people speculate, and this is quite a common theory, that Sasquatch are a modern-day iteration of the biblical Nephilim, where fallen angels impregnated human women and created offspring, hybrid offspring, partially fallen angel, partially human, and that because of these paranormal capabilities, this is what Sasquatch is, because it displays similar capabilities. That may be true. I can't logically conclude against it, but I do know that the Nephilim, as described in the Bible, were considered men of renown. They were fully human, but also more than human. They didn't seem to have an animalistic side to them, at least not the way they're described in the Bible. Of course, there's also talk about fallen angels messing with the genetics of animals in non-biblical ancient texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jasher, and there may well be something to that. Honestly, that's probably the closest thing to checking all the boxes that I've discovered to be true at this point. But really, the truth is, I don't know. But one thing I do know is that every time I try to put these beings in one specific, neatly defined box, the box is ripped apart a few months later as I continue delving into this research. They don't seem to be containable in just one box or category. So what do you do with that if your stated goal is to uncover and understand the full truth of this phenomenon? For me, the only thing I can do at this point is maintain a fully open mind. Test things, weigh things, even conclude against certain claims, but never ever fully dismiss any of it. Because if I do, chances are I'll be proven wrong soon after. Well, there you have it, guys. Everything I've learned, and many things I haven't, about Bigfoot over the last nearly 18 months of complete and utter obsession. If you have any thoughts or insights on what I've shared here, please share them in the comments below, or if you've had any experiences with Sasquatch of your own. I'd love to hear about them, either in the comments, or you can email me. contact@cabininthe-woods-bigfoot.com. I get a lot of messages, so I can't guarantee I'll get back to everyone, but I'll do my best. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share it with your family and friends, and subscribe to Cabin in the Woods. Those things help me to keep going. And if you want to support me further in this research, consider signing up for my Patreon. Links in the description below. For a few bucks a month, you'll get exclusive access to me and my behind-the-scenes Bigfoot research. Either way, thank you so much for watching, guys. I appreciate all of you, and I'll see you all in the next video.